The fact that every single cohort, aside from senior citizen women and unmarried individuals, backs Trump. Why is that going on? What is talks about America being ripped off? He talks about foreign countries. He talks about nothing is built in this country anymore. And so what went against the establishment, you were immediately a right-wing issue. So was Imran Khan and supporting his freedom, is it a left-wing issue or right-wing issue? Unclear unless we know if Imran Khan is pro or anti-Trump. Then
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Alchemy of Transformation. We go in deep into the essence of change, transformation, both of the individual, of the society, of organizations, and of humanity. Today we are at the studios of our friends at Raftar, where we are collaborating for production of this podcast. The podcast is titled The Alchemy of Trump 2.5. Trump is an enigma. Who is he? What does he mean? What would be the world after 4 years of Trump 2.5? What would it look like? So someone who is, I would consider him to be a public policy entrepreneur and a friend. He's also from the Harvard Kennedy School. So he's a Harvard alumnus. But I think I would rate him the fact that he did an AB, an undergraduate at Princeton more. Because Princeton undergraduate is quite very prestigious. He is Taufiq, someone that I have known and I've worked with for the last 10-15 years. So welcome to the podcast, Taufiq. How are you doing today?
good. Thank you for having me, Ahmed. I'm glad we're able to make this across the continents. Looking forward to our conversation.
Absolutely. And tell me, what time is it and where are you and what are you up to these days?
Well, I'm in New York City. It's a little past midnight. So I think it's a good night for me and it's a good morning for you.
It's a very good morning for Karachi. In fact, it's a bit too early of a morning, but we're very pleased to have you, Taufiq. And Taufiq is someone that has been a public policy entrepreneur. So tell us about what is a public policy entrepreneur? Nobody knows it. And I think you're defining it. And particularly, what did your parents say when you said, I'm going to become a public entrepreneur, a public policy entrepreneur?
Well, I think I've gone on many journeys in my career, starting with leaving for Princeton at 17 and just kind of embarking on a series of adventures. I think at each stage, my parents were perplexed at my decision making, but then subsequently always came around. And of course, growing up in Vancouver, Canada, we were quite blessed. My mother's from Pakistan, my father is from Uganda and was a refugee, right, from the Idi Amin times, came to Canada. And so I think they wanted to make sure I had a great upbringing, but of course, I kept venturing back east and always into difficulty and challenge. And so that's always kept them on their toes. But I'd say they've been supportive, and I think the journey has been working out at least so far.
So is it the genes of the Pakistan of your mother, or more of your father of Uganda, of kind of migrating under Idi Amin's stress and everything that led you to become such an explorer?
Well, they're both of Gujarati origin, and and also on my dad's side from Kutch, who then they ventured 150 years ago to East Africa. So quite multi-generational history kind of there. So there's a lot of genetics, and you could always say the imprints on the genetics, right, that we now know about happen. I definitely that plays a role, but it's a mélange of the two, and it's always interesting when we have family over because the East African side wakes up very early, and the Pakistani side sleeps very late. So there's chai kind of at all times. It's just that they're converging sometimes from the early mornings and the late nights.
Absolutely. And it's a very interesting, you mentioned the history of the Gujarat is that as the British kind of establish themselves, the Calcutta and Bombay. A lot of those people migrate to Karachi. Also, a lot of them went to Bombay and Calcutta, and then to Sri Lanka. There's a huge community in Sri Lanka, and then to East Africa. So there's a lot of history behind that, but in essence, it's the same group of people that spread across multiple continents.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's not only is it a place of exploration, at least from that emanated from there, but it's a place of tremendous diversity, ethnically, religiously, culturally. So Gujarat and Gujaratis kind of are embedded with this vibrancy. And it's always interesting because, of course, the prime minister is from Gujarat. I worked in Gujarat many years ago while he was chief minister. And so, I think there's something interesting there. People probably haven't peeled those layers. And like you said, there's a big Gujarati population in Pakistan, but across the continent, in the subcontinent and the diaspora. So a lot of interesting links and ties to kind of unwind.
Some of the wealthiest families in Sri Lanka are actually old Gujarati families who migrated there and got into tea trading. So tell us, as
let's not talk about any of our friends, but yeah.
Yeah. So tell us, as someone who's growing up, and AB from Princeton, then Harvard Kennedy School, and Princeton, people don't realize, liberal arts college is, I would rate it much higher than Harvard. Actually, it's a fantastic place to study. And then you went to McKinsey. So you had all the credentials, and yet you kind of went a very risky, unexplored path. So what's in your past that got you to take such a huge risk and to be persistent with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think I definitely had the opportunity to climb into all of these elite corridors, right? And when you're excelling in school, the way the Western meritocracy is set up is to encourage you to kind of seek refuge in these elite corridors. And then when you're in those elite corridors, it's almost like a dopamine effect, right? It's when you're out with friends, etc., you can be taken in by the dopamine of the social life, right? But in the professional life, which is now only exacerbated or heightened by LinkedIn and other algorithmic aspects, is the dopamine of promotion and the dopamine of elite recognition. And so, if you talked about McKinsey, which I don't want to talk too much about, but if you think about it, you can be a business analyst and an analyst and an associate, so you're getting these dopamines of promotion, and they're always set up in such a way, and so it kind of can lock you in. And I think to escape from that, what is truly exciting, because you have to think about things beyond money. You talked about public policy entrepreneur. Of course, you need to be sustainable. Aristotle would say you must earn as much as you spend, but ultimately, you need to have a certain drive that has to come with a sense of conviction that you need to be on this path for whatever reason, not because you're better, etc., but there is a reason for you to be on that path. And I learned that early on, and I can tell you a little bit about that if you want.
No, because I think we'd want to know that how does Trump 2.5, the book, is a reflection of you or your past, because you spend significant time, did put in a lot of effort to do that. So the person behind that book, and how is your personal values, your experiences, traumas, or whatever you want to share, got you to become this far, who you are today, and then into the book.
Well, so it's a great question, because it does go back to that genesis of when I am a teenager going into Princeton in the year 2000, and the largest issue at the time on campus became the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and it was the Second Intifada. And I found myself in a unique role, being pulled in to different directions and active on campus. And there's a lot over there. The first divestment movement started at that time, and including at Princeton. And I was involved, and then I quit. And when I quit, I got pulled into a lot of newspaper coverage and articles that were praising me quitting the movement. And I ended up on a NPR with Alan Dershowitz. You might know
Yes,
Alan
yes,
Dershowitz.
yes.
And I was 20 years old.
The
And
Harvard Law School professor,
the
very
Harvard
famous,
Law School professor who has
with
some.
very interesting interests
Exactly.
and friends.
Exactly. People can Google so we don't get sued. Uh, and I found myself, they brought me in between kind of two people, but I found myself arguing with Dershowitz on NPR. And I realized that, there is no one political tribe that you can be on. You might take an issue and you might end up on one side of a tribe, and then that tribe might actually end up on another place. And what I realized is you need to have a set of principles, and each issue you're going to have to deal with differently, and your allies might change, and you cannot take political assumptions for granted. And of course, the other issue that rose up while I was on campus was 9/11. And I was a leader of the Muslims Association, and so I was dealing with the fact that the FBI was coming to campus and taking student records. I myself had to deal with a lot of different issues, which are of a personal nature. And so, on one hand, you're confronting what is really a whole environment of surveillance that's directly affecting you. And on the other hand, you're studying public and international affairs. And at that time on campus is Pete Hegseth, who's now the Secretary of Defense. And he was writing for the Princeton Tory. And I was writing against the Iraq War in all of the left-leaning publications at the time. And you're standing there. At that time, it was not popular to write against the Iraq War. And you're militating against that in a way of almost like an opposition person, while this entire elite structure comes against you. And at that same time, Colin Powell gets invited to campus to receive the George Kennan Prize in front of 1,000 people in Richardson Auditorium with the president of the university. And I realized that if I can leverage, instead of saying I want to transact into my next role or being, recognized, I want to transact my ability to be, let's say, present in certain settings, running different organizations, into having input into the discussion and push an idea. And so when Colin Powell, came to campus, for example, and I will just say that this happened the morning after the night before when I had dinner with Henry Kissinger. So you're calibrating. Do I challenge Henry Kissinger, or do I save? If I challenge him too hard, they won't invite me to the morning reception with Colin Powell. And when I was invited to that morning reception because I had this prominent voice on campus, and I had a 5-6 minute argument with Powell, which is documented in photos, etc. And anyways, that microcosmic reality has played itself out in Princeton, Harvard, McKinsey, later on in different circles throughout my entire life. And I have felt that my role is to leverage elite proximity to forward different types of ideas on looking at our political situation today. And I have, over my career, had interaction with every type of leader, from business, politics, internationally, in the United States. And this is why I'm trying to start to bring it all together. And there was no better subject than Trump and the remaking of America, if not, let's be honest, the whole world order at this point in time. And so that's my long-winded answer to your very simple question there.
No, very interesting. And elite proximity, we're going to talk about that, because I think Trump 2.5 is a lot about the proximity factor, and I think we will discuss that. But it's very fascinating, and for people who don't know, Alan Dershowitz is an elite, famous Harvard Law School professor, one of the intellectuals of the Zionist movements, and to go and to debate him as a young person, it's quite a feat, and so it must have been a fascinating experience to get that. And so but you did not pursue in McKinsey. You went into public policy, founded companies. Now you have your book. So, so a lot of people do that. You know, when they say when they're young, they are very passionate, but when they become a bit older, they become more conservative or pragmatism. Somehow, pragmatism hasn't touched you. And so, why has that not happened? And do you think it will ever impact you?
Yeah, I mean, look, you definitely have to balance. This is a materialistic world. It's a capitalist society. We're hyper financialized. You have to have revenue commensurate with your costs, at least to a certain degree. And I think it helps to have that ability. And that's always what I'm safeguarding against. But if you get too big, and I think there's two ways to look at it, Ahmad. If you really want to forward ideas, really want to shape the debate, really have integrity, really have authenticity, you can either be really big, or you can stay of a certain size that allows you to be nimble and flexible. And so it actually becomes pragmatic to continue to maintain that entrepreneurial spirit, not get too married into the myth of yourself and what you're building, and continue to project new ideas, even ideas that challenge your own philosophical underpinnings that existed before. So you have to shatter your own illusions of truth in the pursuit of greater truth.
So this is very interesting, and one discussion I recall in Kennedy School, and they said when you look thinking about development, you should think at one end are the entrepreneurs who are the most innovators. They are the ones who are taking the risk, and that's where the innovation is coming from. But on the other hand are the world banks and the big development financial institutions, which are very influential, which give you scale, but they're hardly any innovative. And so it depends on which side you want to play on. And I do certainly feel, having come back to Pakistan, that I think it's the innovation style side, or ideas or new ideas. That's the one where top quality talent is missing. The world banks of the world soak in all the best talent onto the scaling, the bureaucratic side of it rather than the innovative side of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. I mean, it's you can't just on one hand fight the system. You have to be part of the system. Then the question is, which part of the system can attract the talent? And for countries that are outside of the West, the places such as the NGOs and the IGOs traditionally were able to pay these salaries where you wouldn't then choose to work there rather than inside the country, which then the country system also had a lot of different, cronyism, other types of, let's say, non-meritocratic features that just wouldn't endear themselves to, let's say somebody like yourself or others who are trying to, be as professional and reach a level of excellence in their workplace environment. Obviously, that is a situation that may start to change given Trump 2.5 and the policies that they're enacting around funding for the international system. So we may see a reorientation of some of that, at least in some countries.
So I think and thank you very much for that. And I think one just last point is that elite proximity. The most richest people in Pakistan are the ones who are closest to, the bureaucratic or the government circles. So in some parts of the world where you don't have strong institutions, it does create a very sustainable financial model, but perhaps not so much in the more developed and the more institutionalized world. But coming back to the topic of discussion today, we've heard of Microsoft 1.0, Microsoft 2.0, Microsoft 3.0, and that kind of a thing. But we haven't heard of anyone say about 2.5. So, Taufiq, what is Trump 2.5?
Well, if you can see here the cover, and we have the three kind of apparitions of Trump, and you have, Trump 1.0. That's really, coming in the first term, 2017, he's the president, 4 years, and then he has this intervening period. And we come to, 2025, and obviously people think the second term, Trump 2.0, But there is this intervening period where he goes through these trials and tribulations. He learns who his allies are. He distills his policies, and that kind of adds an element. So it's not just the return of Trump, the second coming of Trump, and just Trump 2.0. It's something more. And that's where Trump 2.5 comes in. And it's the element that kind of is a thread woven throughout the book, where it's something additional that is not just a feature but is central. And if you underestimate what that means, that is when you're left behind, which is what we see happening with a lot of people. They don't understand why he's doing certain things, how certain policies are being carried out. It appears chaotic. There doesn't appear to be any method to the madness, but actually when you go within it, you realize that this is something that is really consolidated this time around.
So, just now, when you explained this, and this is a fascinating way to explain the trials and tribulations in the interim period, it reminded me of another historical character who had that in similar kind of thing, but of course very different, and that was Moses. Because if you think about Moses, was brought up in the household of the kings. He had all the luxuries, everything, but then he had years of wilderness and some revelation, and then he came back to be a king, but a different kind of a king. So when you're talking about the Trump coming back at 2.5, it kind of drew a parallelism with that. So tell us a bit more about the wilderness that you've talked about, because that's the juice. That's where a man's views, opinions, belief systems are formed. What really happened there, and why is that important?
Well, it's Joseph Campbell, talks about myth of a thousand faces, and we see it in both reality and in our myth making, the same type of recurring elements, and it's neither necessarily meant to be positive or negative, but it's people think about the hero's journey. The hero is a central figure, right? And the hero can be flawed. The hero can do flawed things. But Trump has followed that journey in an archetypal way. I mean, he wouldn't be the same if he had just won in 2021. He wouldn't be as effective. He wouldn't be carrying this out. And even for his base to be consolidated, the popularity that it has, the Generation Z that's behind now the Trump administration, the fact that every single cohort, aside from senior citizen women and unmarried individuals, backs Trump. Why is that going on? What has changed in the zeitgeist and the culture? And so a lot of layers get formed there. And I think in his particular case, his thread goes all the way back to 1980. And that's why one of the first chapters in the book is The Man, the Myth, and MAGA, is really tracing the evolution of Trump throughout his career and how he arrives into this position. But what happens in the last 4 years is he cares much less about anything coming after his next 4 years. And so he is not waiting. And maybe the assassinations had a very particular effect, but there is something different even in the very calculated decision making that he is making and putting into place.
So that sounds very interesting, about what Trump has, and that Trump 2.5 or Trump in the second term would not have been the same had he had won in 2021, which he still believes that he won. So tell us, or can you read, Tawfiq, an interesting, insightful, exciting part of your book, so the viewers can get a flavor of what you've written.
Well, what I will say is I'll just kind of walk you through what's actually in the book so you kind of have a sense and your readers have a sense. Uh, you know, we start with kind of an upfront section, that's in here on just kind of what you need to know. But then, as I mentioned, it goes in the second chapter into the man, the myth, and MAGA. So how does he flow from, the man growing up in Queens to, the real estate developer, this young brash kid in his early 30s building Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue and buying the airspace over the Tiffany store, and really leading this whole, golden, 80s, that's, typified by greed, right? And it culminates with the Gordon Gekko type figures. And he was the head of that locomotive, and starting to, go on TV and dancing at Studio 54, etc., and dating these Eastern European models, etc., who he then, married, two different models. His first wife and his third wife. Second wife is an American model, Marla Maples. And so this charts a lot of that. In the process of that, Ahmad, I also watched, close to 50 interviews of Trump over the years, including going back to 1980 is one of his first major kind of, interviews. And you can see a similar trend line of this man who talks about America being ripped off. He talks about foreign countries. He talks about nothing is built in this country anymore. And so what you see today, we have Trump 2.5, we have this trials and tribulations, we have this man returning, but it really goes back to those early days, that kind of sentiments that he had. And so by the time you get to the third chapter, which is on the principles and policies, which elevates a little bit beyond just Trump, but what are the principles and then what are the policies of the White House, foreign policy and domestic policy, which is where we talk a little bit about, Pakistan. You're getting into that much more kind of structured frame, but that DNA is consistent, which he's laid out in the second chapter. And then the fourth chapter, which is on people and positions, is for some people the most interesting one. That's where they're spending, a couple hours is, going back, seeing who's there. We have everybody from Darren Beattie, as you know, to, Steve Bannon, to, Laura Loomer. How do these people all flow into the MAGA world, into Trump world? But when you ask me what my favorite parts of the book is, I mean, it's really the last chapter, the way forward, which is kind of like, how do you engage? Or if you want, because some people, Trump is against their values. He's not at all a prophet like Moses. He's devil incarnate. And so some people might choose to disengage. How do you do that? How do you follow that? But in that section, I also talk about two things that I think are worth reading, which are what I call the Mars shot, which I think is going to be very interesting, and America's 250th anniversary, where we're going to see a series of events. We're going to see a military parade, for example, which will coincide with Trump's, I believe, 79th birthday. So there's, a lot of spectacle, but also just the imagination of space will be coming into this moment. And so I think there's going to be a lot of mixed emotions for people.
And so tell us a bit more about the Mars, what you said?
Mars shot. I call it the Mars shot. People call it the moon shot. But in the book here, I have a section on, the Mars shot. I don't know how these cameras work, but you can see there, Mars shot right there. Very unprofessionally, just, doing this in our professional podcast. But I talk about, I'll just read you something here. In 1962, then President John F. Kennedy gave a landmark speech, "We Choose to Go to the Moon," in which he reinforced that America would reach the moon during that decade. By the time this was achieved, he had passed, but the milestone stood the test of time. The Trump administration will promote space exploration during this term, with Elon Musk already playing a centripetal role.
Very interesting. And some people say there is also another commonality with JFK, because JFK was the first president of the medium of television. And of course, he was very charismatic and he came across very well on television, and that's how he won the elections. And Trump, in a way, is the first candidate of the the social media generation, and how he used the social media to do that. So there is a kind of comparison between the two. And of course, I think one thing which is very instrumental in Trump's winning was the TV show that he used to run, and with the very famous, like, "You're fired." And I think that has made him a household name. And so there's a lot of commonality between him and JFK.
Yeah, and also the wealth. I think they both are scions of, families. They have independent wealth and standing. And I think this makes both of them less beholden to powerful interests at play. Now, politically, they might be on different sides, and that's a debate for the Kennedy family itself, right? Which is split on this dimension with RFK Jr. serving in the administration. But they both opposed the establishment in very dramatic ways, including geopolitically and initiating talks with America's enemies.
So tell us, that's fascinating. The commonality between JFK and Trump, and although their policy may look completely opposite, but underneath there is an anti-establishment flavor to both of them. So tell us a little bit about Trump's view of what you call the deep state. Why is he so opposed to it? And would a deep state, and technically the deep state has been running the world, the international establishment, or the international deep state, and has got links to the Pakistani or the Indian deep state, and this whole network has been running the world since Enlightenment. Democracy is there to keep people under control and to give them some participation, but it is the deep state that actually runs the show. So why is he so opposed to it? Number one, given that he is from the elite, and number two is that how his presidency going to change the essence, the nature, the action, and the composition of the deep state?
Well, it's always, I think, what is the deep state and what is the establishment and what is the elite and what is simply the bureaucracy of a government. I think these are the challenges, and in terms of dissecting this term, because deep state brings to the fore notions of a cabal of people, coordinating, and just by virtue of the first 100 days of Trump's term now, the deep state doesn't seem very strong. It seems like a shallow state to an extent. Now, parts of the establishment are rebelling. Obviously, the media in America is on one side of the political spectrum. So the grandiosity of the deep state, in one sense, might be overstated. But I think generally, if we speak about the establishment and the establishment becoming very politicized over the last 15 years, to a degree that it all landed on one side of a political spectrum. And very strangely, it was not clear internationally if you were then a left-wing issue or a right-wing issue. If you went against the establishment, you were immediately a right-wing issue. So was Imran Khan and supporting his freedom, is it a left-wing issue or right-wing issue? Unclear unless we know if Imran Khan is pro or anti-Trump. Then the establishment in the United States will determine whether this is worth supporting or not. And then you would be right-wing and against democracy. So in that sense, if you were Trump, you had no choice but to oppose the establishment writ large. But there was a bifurcated establishment in America, right, that co-opted a lot of, let's say, right-wing figures and so forth. But Trump's role from the 1980s in real estate, in how he entered popular culture, in how he entered then mainstream politics, was one, as the villain, two, as the outsider, and three, as always the anti-establishment elite figure who actually related to the masses, right? So yes, he's apprentice in the boardroom, but he is the people's CEO, right? And he's appealing to all of these people in the street who know his catchphrase, "You're fired." And so he's a Gatsby-esque figure. And he's got this tremendous contradiction in himself, trying to overturn the elite and establishment and all the institutions while still being recognized by them and appealing to them. So while they are against everything that American companies are doing, Scott Bessent is speaking, this week when we're having our podcast at the, Milken conference in LA. You have Trump, lambasting Jeffrey Goldberg and the Atlantic for Signalgate, and yet he's giving an interview to Jeffrey Goldberg at the Atlantic. And his team will rail against the fake news, but every Sunday they're on the Sunday shows that they're railing against. So this is, a very, very interesting part of the dynamic of Trump, and it interrelates to every aspect of his political rise, the notion of the establishment, and then what does that mean for the overall kind of way the world works.
So, do you think that the establishment, which is mostly around DC or New York, be it Wall Street or the big lobbying firms, but now the tech, and particularly the big tech, is now going to make its presence felt more within the establishment of the deep state of the United States, and kind of Trump, by bringing in Elon and others, has kind of midwifed that transition in the composition of the deep state in the US?
Yeah, I mean, in many senses, if you go back to the early 2000s, Google, even the formation of SpaceX, how was, SpaceX formed? How did, Elon Musk start procure rockets? What's the relationship with InQtel, which is, the CIA's venture fund? What's the relationship between DARPA and Google? What is the relationship between Eric Schmidt and the Department of Defense? And these are all publicly available mainstream
And for the
aspects.
benefit, what is the link of Eric Schmidt in Department of Defense
Oh,
or
he served,
DARPA?
different policy advisory boards and helped with, innovation over the years. There's a DARPA link with Google going back many years. There's InQtel links with many companies in Silicon Valley. And so the links between, just the underlying military industrial establishment in the United States and Silicon Valley, goes back a quarter century. And has been very embedded. And Elon Musk, and SpaceX is a very big defense contractor, right? So even Trump's Golden Dome, that he's talking about building this missile shield defense, well, of course, SpaceX would be tremendously involved in that. And Elon Musk has the highest security clearance that you can really get in government, aside from a few government officials. And that predates the Trump administration. So it begs the question, I think for the people who are on, let's say, the side where they're saying we're MAGA and we're overturning the deep state, Trump's move is to delever parts of this establishment from its left-wing political affiliation. But he is more incorporating some of the deep state into what he is doing and trying to take some of the establishment in the direction of what he's doing. He may neuter some aspects of this infrastructure, but it is not at all, at least not yet, any type of real uprooting. And many of the personalities are the same and have been around. And I will just add one thing, Bannon himself, has had all sorts of links over the years in Hollywood, in, private capital. He had a relationship with Walid bin Talal. So not even the most extraneous figures are deeply embedded inside the establishment in the United States. And many of them went to Princeton and Harvard, by the way. So if you, in the personnel section of the book, I don't mention all the university affiliations, but I found that there's many of them, and they all went to school with each other. Like Jake Sullivan and J.D. Vance were at Yale Law School around the same time. These are not. This is not somehow aliens coming from outer space taking over the United States.
And of course, Peter Thiel is somewhere around all of these people,
Yes.
Miraculously at the investing or buying or selling companies related to all of these people. So that's a very interesting, because in essence, what you're saying, there is an insider outsider, and the people who are able to bring some change have that thing that they are an insider, but they have also an outsider perspective. And of course, Moses is an example of that. But also there were the Medici's and some of the other change makers who had that kind of tension that goes on. So I think that's very interesting, what you state. So and in terms of so how does Elon Musk, whilst being the most highly cleared person civilian in the government, then goes into Department of Defense and tries to cut it, in so many parts, and then it somehow people get really upset and becomes the quote unquote the enemy of the Department of Defense. How does that happen, and how does it kind of play itself out?
Well, I think Elon Musk, his role, and I talk about this in the book, will have a second act, and Doge is the first act. Overall, Doge's mandate goes until the 250th anniversary of America, July 4th, 2026. And I think Musk has already done what he was intended to do, which is jumpstart it. And he will move to his second act, which is about American manufacturing and robotics, and then particularly space exploration. His relationship with the Department of Defense is very close, remains close, and remains so heavily integrated that nothing that's gone on will affect that. He is a central feature of the most important geopolitical effort of the United States at this time, which is space supremacy. And there is nothing short of a really unmitigated disaster that would delever Elon Musk right now from the US military industrial complex.
So that's very enlightening to know that the American deep state, you may have a policy difference or a difference of opinion, a very strong one with someone, but as long as you're useful, valuable, and you have an alignment on a key area, you're able to ally with them, work with them, and you don't become like a permanent enemy. That's very interesting.
It's if you in the current situation, because in the current situation, the establishment becomes delinked from one another, and it is not consolidated into a political apparatus. So the Department of Defense has a certain views, doesn't become the same views of civic activists in Minnesota. But when everything gets collapsed, the decision making is diffuse. And so certain pillars of a sector could be overruled. So someone might say this is the best for defense, but it might be overruled by a more interlinked, politically collapsing establishment. And that's what Trump has done, is kind of taken a change. And that, I think that means that certain people won't get, let's say, expunged from the scene.
So, I think we talked about, the deep state and its impact, and left, what you would call woke policies. I think Vivek Ramaswamy is absent at this moment, and presumably he realized things are gonna not work out too well, and so he's kind of running for office. But I do remember his podcast, and he was very interesting point. He said, now we are not against right or left. We are, because of woke policies, we think this is the creation of the bureaucracy. And he talks about this bureaucratic monolith which just exists to survive, to perpetuate its power, perpetuate its success, regardless of what are the outcomes for the people. And he calls it anti-American. And he calls that the American founding fathers were the most anti-bureaucratic people. They were entrepreneurs, they were risk takers, they were explorers. And somehow now, at the time of enlightenment, you have the democracy, but underneath, whatever you call the deep state, but in essence, it's the bureaucracy. And that bureaucracy needs to be uprooted and needs to change. So I'm actually a big fan of Doge, and I feel that we need to do something in Doge like Pakistan, and I call it Doji Pakistan, which means Doge Yankee style in Pakistan. Because I think the bureaucracy is what prevents change from happening in a society, and it keeps things the way it is, and it only perpetuates itself. And in order to progress, you need to make it weaker and actually introduce power from other sides of society. So what do you think of that argument, and how's Trump playing into it?
Well, I think Vivek Ramaswamy is gonna have to remake himself a little bit in Ohio, and we'll see if that occurs. I think he has a lot of backing, and he's much more formidable than his opponents understand, because he's a trusted figure with a lot of the establishment that's now present in DC. I think the notion that he forwarded around bureaucracy is an interesting one. I had a podcast episode called Democracy, Bureaucracy, Autocracy, and how this interplays within the United States and around the world, both overall in the world within a rules-based order and then by country. And this is as part of the season I did last year on 2040 World. So, I think the challenge, and this is a very, very big challenge for a lot of countries. This is an American world. So there is an American bureaucracy that has become bloated and does kind of serve itself and has a lot of features. There is a global bureaucracy that's then linked to the United States that kind of pseudo manages affairs of the world, or at least puts a fig leaf of management on top of it, allows for certain interactions. And then there is the linked domestic bureaucracy with the United States and global bureaucracy. And within each country, there's these kind of linked bureaucracies, sometimes more direct, and sometimes it doesn't seem they're as direct. And then you have the appendages, which are they're not from the global, they're not in this domestic linked, and then they're not necessarily in the US. They're the NGOs, the nonprofits, the media, but that are getting funding, that are incentivized by, that represent, and through osmosis, elites who might, like us, go to the Kennedy School. We start to think we have careers and pathways. We develop a whole ethos of being within these infrastructures, not realizing we're just part of this kind of, octopus. And so when we talk about reform in Pakistan, it's you then have to parse, say, well, what is really particularly Pakistani bureaucracy that stands apart or separate from this?
Yeah.
And then that comes to a very, very critical question around power.
Yes.
Because the number one thing is sovereignty. And the biggest challenge for countries today is to understand the concept of their power. And I think Pakistan, in a very, very strange and quixotic way, has a concept of power because it has been ruled very openly by the military for so many years, which very clearly is saying you can have all of these chess pieces move on the board, but we are the board and we can move at any time. And by the nakedness of that means that there doesn't need to be fake conversations. And if then the reform of the bureaucracy can happen with that very real kind of situation, then I think there are reforms that can take place. But the United States, in whatever they're doing with Doge, etc., will not work in other countries, because the predicate has to be, how is your power derived in your country? And then how that power is exercised is the bureaucracy. It's the medium through which the power is exercised with the people and society. So you have to start with the power, and then you can move with how it's exercised. And if you don't resolve the former, it's just a lot of pageantry with the reforms of bureaucracy in these respective countries, including Pakistan.
So I think this is a great point to talk about Pakistan, the US, the international bureaucracy and the global and how it's linked to it, because all of it plays in Pakistan. We have the US influence, we have the European Union influence, which is, you can say, part of the global architecture. We've got the World Bank and IMFs of the world, and then of course we have the local bureaucracy or establishment. So in your view, in your analysis, in Imran Khan's tragic fall from power, being very, very popular, then becoming unpopular, and then suddenly becoming popular again. So what actually happened in the interplay between the different bureaucracies that Imran, absolutely not, saying to the US, ended up him being in jail, out of power, and then being in jail?
Yeah, I mean, look, at the end of the day, power in Pakistan derives from the military. And Imran Khan himself recognized that fact. And the argument the military would make would be that this is also the national interest. And Imran Khan, at some point, the argument would be made is contravene the national interest. And in the United States case, which has a close relationship with Pakistan and the military for many years, if Imran Khan is opposing American policies and interests, that is against the American national interest. And if it is rising to a certain level, that is also then against the Pakistani national interest. And then the interconnected powers are ultimately going to come down against any figure, Imran Khan or elsewhere. And in his case, he particularly underestimated his own power. This is very, very clearly uh, what happened. And he went against power structures within Pakistan while overestimating his own power. And so that to now unwind that is very different today. How do you kind of come out of that situation where we are today? But at that time, that is what occurred. And while people may say that's unfair, I would tell them that there is no such thing as fairness. There is only power. And politics is the expression of that power. And in effect, this is why populists are becoming the uh, force today in the world, because you have three forms of power in the world today.
Mm-hmm.
You have the American power, which is the American imperial power, however we put it. Within different countries to varying degrees, you have military asserted power and control that stands either integrated, adjacent, or semi linked with the empire's power, right? So China and Russia are separate. North Korea and Iran have managed to be separate. Then you have more semi-adjacent countries. Turkey is trying to establish a semi-adjacent reality. Pakistan would say that maybe we have a semi-adjacent, maybe we can be like Turkey, but that is to me, yeah, exactly, right. That would be the desire that people would say on paper is there, but not in reality. And then you have populism, because if you cannot muster the military capability to have autonomous indigenous power, you can through people. And why is that the case? People think they talk about power and weapons. At the end of the day, it's somebody shooting a gun, somebody acting as a soldier, somebody carrying out orders. Even in a dictatorship, it's one person. Kim Jong-un is not taking a million people and forcing them to go and do something or enforce a law. So people have to be convinced, and they might do so because they don't believe that they could contravene something, etc. Unless there's populism, and populism creates a force amongst people that power then cannot control the existing power structure. And that is why we're seeing that in places, and it is the only hope for Imran Khan is populism.
And the question then becomes is that the vested interest, which is the military, does technology, demographics, other factors have taken power away from it to create another source of power, which is the people. Like Erdogan was able to do, I think Imran tried it but hasn't succeeded. So of course, the Pakistan is a very unique, interesting place because Pakistan is free for 75 years as an identity, but the Pakistan military, what you call the Punjab regiment, existed from 1743, and the Baluch regiment existed from 1842. So you have a country whereby its specific institutions, the military institution, has had a identity, a form, a traditions which are at least 2 to 4 times longer than the history of the country. So naturally that organization is going to dominate. And I think the only thing you can do is bring in the power of the people. Erdogan was able to do that in 2007, and then later on he was able to do that. But Imran tried, but he failed. What was it that Imran, what do you think were his mistakes? You said he underestimated it, and number one. And number two, there was a lot of hope that when Trump would come, who was in essence an anti-establishment person, a lot of the establishment support for Imran Khan, would change and it would become more favorable towards Imran Khan.
Yeah, I think that there are people, we talked about Darren Beattie and others in the State Department who are actively looking at Imran Khan's case and who will work on his situation. But there are broader foreign policy objectives of the Trump administration that take precedence. The terrorist attack recently does not help the situation, but it may if for Imran Khan if he plays his cards right. But the broader discussions with Iran, the broader discussions with China, the Ukraine Russia conflict, and the situation in Gaza are of preeminent importance and involve a lot of other geostrategic players, whether it includes India or China and neighbors of Pakistan. So I think this is one of the reasons for why the file is not so preeminent, and changes which then lead to complications. How do you manage a country like Pakistan? The U.S. doesn't want to midwife that country, right? Right now, it's there. So I don't think the so-called Eye of Sauron will turn immediately, but it could come all of a sudden. So people should be ready, and one day some tweet will go out, and I think that's what's going to happen.
Are you still hopeful that a tweet will happen? Because a lot of people believe that that's not the case. Richard Grenell had been active, but he's gone silent. But you feel, and what is the reason? And what is Trump 2.5 that tells you that something like that can still happen?
Well, I think, first of all, the principles are in play around globally. And we see it playing on Europe right now, where they do not want the establishment in any facet to be politicized against them. And so this is where in Pakistan, it was seen that in a very consolidated way, the establishment became almost anti-Trump and collaborating with its opponents, right? In some degree, in perpetuating the Ukraine war. And, part of that ties up to the State Department memo and conversation and so forth. So I think there's a lot of unwinding on those files, which lead directly to the Pakistan military, to the current political establishment, and that were in effect angling against certain interests of the current Trump administration and its policies, and in many ways emboldening its opponents. But to the degree that it rises to a level of extreme importance, I don't see that. And that's why I don't think it's something that's of priority. But because this administration runs on whimsy, yesterday, I mean, I don't know when you will release the podcast, but for the timing purposes of this podcast recording, we had a tweet go out about Hollywood and tariffs about Hollywood. And they're going to have 100% tariffs on films that aren't made in America. And that doesn't seem like the most important concern. And yet Trump just tweeted that. And that's just after he tweeted or truthed on his Truth Social platform that he's going to reopen Alcatraz. And nobody was talking about Alcatraz. So just the nature of who Trump is, there is no, method to when. There might be a coherence of some underlying principles, but the when is different. I think you had a second question around what Imran Khan could have done differently, correct?
Yeah. Yes.
Erdogan's a great case study because Erdogan, number one, he's playing a tremendous role vis-a-vis great powers and establishing Turkey, his presence as an autonomous semi-power, middle power in the world. Now, whether Erdogan is a Democrat, whether he's good for Turkey, whether he improves social cultural mores, I leave that to others to debate. But he's very much consolidated power. And he's consolidated power for himself in Turkey and apart from the United States, writ large, so that he has, his own standing. That happened very particularly after the coup, some years ago, which he reversed. I think what Imran Khan did not learn from Erdogan is that Erdogan spent a decade before the coup reorienting the entire military. And the coup attempt against him was essentially a symptom or a result of that entire effort to remake the leadership and the rank and file in the Turkish military that had been a certain way for half a century. And he did that by allying with Gulenist and Fethi Gulen.
Gulen, yes, Hizmet.
Exactly. So, yeah, I mean, at one point he turned against his own people and people that he had installed. But what Erdogan did, a two-phase situation. He first removed and cleansed through maybe illegal procedures, etc., members of the military, slowly and steadily. In the first few years, he did nothing. He just, you know, got along with the military. Then he started to cleanse them, step by step. When somebody would retire, he would replace them and, put people here, and then they would rise up. But then those people were also, he didn't have full control. And then he did a second cleanse. And now we see the types of people who are around him, even in government, like Ibrahim Kalin and Hakan Fidan. And these are very serious people who were also very much in this whole intelligentsia apparatus. So it's a decade and a half. And I think Imran Khan thought just being popular and people supporting your policies is what gets you power, and it's not.
So now that we've come to towards the end of it, what is it that? So tell us, what would be the end of Trump term would look like, and any predictions for that? Firstly, that, and then also how, if somebody wants to read on the book, read the book, buy the book, get involved with what the work and the research that you're doing, how do they get to know a lot more of what you're doing?
Sure, yeah. I mean, so definitely we have a site for the book, trumpprimer.com. You can find all the links to purchase the book there, whether it's on Amazon, which is obviously globally the best place. The audiobook is about to come out, so I know some people are interested in that. But also on the site, we have a whole section on resources where you can get more information, where to access news, what are the best books to read other than, of course, Trump 2.5 or Primer. And then we have a section on updates where we're putting in the changes, so we have a change in the national security advisor. So we're keeping those updates flowing. So this is a very dynamic situation, and we want people to be able to incorporate new facts into the knowledge base from the book. And then, of course, check out the 2040 World podcast on Spotify, because we'll have season 2 coming out in a couple of months, which will be very, very fascinating. These are 12-part seasons, and I think we'll speak to a lot of the themes we raised, Ahmad. In terms of what happens over the next, 4 years, I don't really get into the game of predictions because overall, never, results or unfolds in the way you think it will. And in particular, right now, there's a lot of second and third order effects because things are changing dramatically. So that the type of things we're going to see, I don't think, we've seen. I'll give you a little bit of a left field kind of thing to think about. For 80, plus years, we've been talking about power in a certain way, and American power and this kind of Bretton Woods and rules-based order. And a lot of what's happening right now, people are talking about the unpacking of this order, the changing of this order, end of an era. And of course, even the tagline of the book is navigating the new American era, right? So I get that. And that is definitely something, sorry, there's just a little bit of a message. There's something in, the mix. However, even technologically, everybody's looking at the acceleration, artificial intelligence. We look at OpenAI, and all of these type of things that are happening. But I think there's something else that we need to pay attention to over the next 4 years, for sure, but definitely over the next 5-10 years. And that is something that we don't see coming. And that seems like a very amorphous thing to say. But when we go back to similarly transformative periods of time, the 1880s to 1920s. We see electricity come out of nowhere. We see flying. Humans are on the ground, and now they can fly everywhere. We see telephones going ubiquitous. We see television, come to light. We see cars. So within a span of 10, 15 years, cataclysmic things that were magic and part of you had fire, and then you have light. Light, it's like a magic trick. When they first had Edison and Tesla, people looked at it as a magic trick. And I say that because underneath it all, and AI acceleration helps us, there's a lot being kind of developed. And I think we're going to see something dramatic technologically that will make some of the discussions and debates we have, which we think we're so profound about, seem obsolete. And I think being ready to adapt to that will be what differentiates the people who succeed, the countries who succeed, and those who don't.
Fantastic. And thank you. With that, I think we'll wrap it up. And I think and I totally agree with that. I think the US, by having Trump, a lot of people may think, has put itself in a difficult situation. But I think what it has done is to catalyze, speed up change of the world as it goes from an industrial, mechanical, energy-based society to a digital society. And so that, whether it is the shape of the economy, whether it is new sectors like space exploration, whether it is the composition of the deep state, or all of those things have to change and modify and improve with time. And I think Trump, whether some of his actions are taken as naive or kind of not thought through, I think what he will do is kind of shake up the existing system to kind of the ossified system, and for it to now settle or at least change in a way that the US is better able to deal with the age of technology, age of digital media, much better than other countries. Other countries are going to go through the same pain. The US has started going through it earlier, and it will come out of it earlier. So I think that's the lesson from the podcast today, and I'm very grateful to my friend Taufiq, who I do meet time to time in Dubai, and we have a laugh about what's happening in the world. It's a fantastic thing that instead of becoming a MD, a senior partner at McKinsey, Taufiq has decided to be a public policy entrepreneur and to think about the bigger issues of the world and solve problems at a systems level and humanity level. I think that's very important to come up with new ideas to do that. If you want to know more about his thinking, you've got to read the book. If you want to predict how Trump is going to act in case of Pakistan, with Imran Khan, or with India, you've got to read that book. It is the most detailed, comprehensive analysis of Trump's history, of his ideas, and what's going to shape the administration in the next 4 years. So with that, thank you very much for joining us for another episode of Alchemy of Transformation, this time Alchemy of Trump 2.5. Do subscribe to the channel and do listen into this podcast and refer and forward it to your friends and families. Thank you very much.